who is very ill. So she has had to fly to Alberta to be with her brother. So she won't be here today. So welcome again. I just want to start off with this screen. I am Nadine McSpadden, and I am a education consultant with Len Pierre Consulting. And if you want to take a screenshot of this screen here, you'll have access to hit our website, and also Len Pierre Consulting also has a YouTube channel, and he also has podcasts that are featured on Spotify. So if you want to do a screen grab of that, it'll give you a sense of some resources that you can access. The LPC website I will refer to a couple of times because we're going to look at how to do land acknowledgements, or there's a resource there for it, and also how to protocols around inviting elders and guests into your classroom. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, I have time.
Okay.
And I
I'll
think,
take my time and just book it with you.
okay, sounds good.
Just gonna
And I
make
think,
it-
actually,
And before we get started, I'll just
meeting got
ask
canceled.
you to mute your screens, please.
I am just going through and muting everybody. Okay. Looks like we're good on that
Yeah.
front.
So Candace, did you want to say anything before we get started?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you guys all for having me in your space. My name is Candace Crockford. I am from Katesy First Nation. As of fairly recently, at the end of September last year, I joined LPC full-time as an associate consultant. So I get to do a bunch of consulting stuff as well as just random things that Len throws at me. One of those being our session today. This is my first time moderating a session. So I will make sure to check the chat box and admit people and do all the behind the scenes stuff for Nadine while she is presenting today. Please know that if you would like a question to be confidential, you can message me directly. And that is perfectly okay. I won't call you out on anything. So you can message me directly and I won't say your name out loud. Yeah, I think that's it. Other than that, I will pass it off to Nadine.
So Cookstochum, Candace. So before we get started, I am situated right now in Walnut Grove in Langley. And down the street from me is Katesy First Nation. I walk down in that area probably every night with my dog. So I want to acknowledge that I am on the unceded traditional territory of Katesy First Nation, Kwantlen First Nation, and I recognize that this whole area was also well used by many First Nation Coast Salish people. When I do an acknowledgement, I try and look at it from my own perspective, in that I want to do an act of my own truth and reconciliation. So even though I'm Indigenous, I find it really important that I continue to do the work and continue to make relationships with local land-based nations and Métis groups in the Lower Mainland. And just because I'm Indigenous doesn't mean that I don't have to continue the learning. So I try to attend workshops that are hosted by local First Nation artists, by guest speakers. Joseph Dandurand had a book launch. I attended that. And by attending those events and local powwows that are hosted by local First Nation groups, it helps me establish relationships with them and helps me be able to get to know them better, which is truly what reconciliation is about, is forming those important relationships. If you would like to, would you like to share your location and the land-based nation whose territory you are on in our chat, just so we can see where everybody is from? Oh, we have Malahat. Cool. Oh, okay, perfect. Colleen, thank you. So I'm just looking to see, we've got people from all over. It looks like this is awesome. And I'm noticing too that many of you have great words in the way that you're doing your acknowledgements too. Oh, from Souk. Hey, I used to live in Victoria, so happy to see somebody from Souk here. Great. Yeah, and you can keep adding where you're from and in your area in the chat, and we'll carry on. One of the things that Lempier Consulting has done is when we are invited to go into schools or when we're invited to do professional development for businesses and associations, is we have usually the host of the session say, well, would you do the land acknowledgement? And a lot of it is because people have a fear or anxiety about doing it incorrectly. So Len has created a beautiful transformative territorial acknowledgement guide. And if you take a screenshot of this, it'll take you to that guide and you're welcome to use that. If you go to the LPC YouTube channel, he also has created a beautiful video that really helps anybody create their own territorial land acknowledgement. And we find this to be really important because too often now we're going into situations where people are just kind of reading a script and it's lost its meaning. So, you know, when I tell people when they're doing territorial acknowledgements is to try and do it from the heart, not to read it from a piece of paper. I've seen lots of teachers now who are actually doing this as a lesson with their students. So each classroom is writing their own territorial acknowledgements so that when they have knowledge keepers come in, they can do this for the knowledge keeper. And it's just a way of showing respect to guests who are coming into the school. Lots of people, oh wow, from everywhere here. Casey Quantlin. Oh, great. Perfect. Thank you for sharing where you're from. Glad to see that we have a variety from all over the place. So I'm just going to move my chat box here. So tonight we're going to be talking about building relationships. So when I talk about relationships, I'm talking about relationships with Indigenous learners, their families, and the local land-based nations and Indigenous organizations that support our families. So that's the topic of tonight's conversation. So my intention setting is that I really want this to be a safe place for us to have conversation and to share ideas and to show support for one another. Tonight's session, you will have more opportunity to be involved in conversation. I know last week was a lot of just listening to Twyla and I talk. So please know you will have a chance to converse tonight. And I come with an open heart and an open mind. You know, when I first started doing these sessions and working for Lempier Consulting and walking into organizations where, you know, dealing with topics around anti-racism and allyship, I always felt so nervous. But I find if I ground myself and know that I'm doing this work from a good place and with an open heart and an open mind, it calms me and it changes the tone for the session. So we do recognize that you will probably want to share stories, but we just ask that you respect the confidentiality of any students or families in your conversation. So try not to use any names, and I will do my best not to do the same thing. So group norms, I came across this when I worked for Squamish Nation. I worked in one of their it was Capilano Little Ones in North Vancouver. And as an administrator there, we participated in professional learning communities, which was awesome. And we had to commit when we attended these sessions to a number of things. And one that we had to be mindful of our choice of words and tone. And we had to mention this because I don't know if you're like me, you've sent a text to someone or you've sent an email. And sometimes the meaning is misconstrued, and people's feelings get hurt. So let's just be super mindful of our word choice when we're typing in chat or when we're speaking. I'm just going to ask that we be respectful and that we be present. And that's the tough one. I mean, I'm so sorry that these sessions are held at 3:30 at the end of the day when you've already had a long day. So, but we just ask that you be present and participate in the conversation to the best of your ability. So you can raise your hand if you wanted to have, if you have something you want to say immediately, and Candace will watch for that. Or you can also put a question in the chat box. And we're just going to ask, or I'm going to ask that no blaming or shaming allowed. And, you know, Twyla and I, when we were preparing for these workshops. We've both been in Indigenous education for a really long time, and it's hard to sometimes let the frustrations go that we have experienced and really, come forward in this work in a good way and in a positive way, and looking for things that work rather than looking and addressing things that don't work. So, building relationships with who? So I mentioned this earlier already. So the Indigenous students and families who enter our public school system. So this, for those of you who weren't here for the first session, this is really addressing how we support Indigenous learners in public education. But I'm sure it transfers to private and band operated schools too. So, how are we building relationships with students and families? How are you building relationships with the Indigenous staff in your school? And also the Indigenous staff in your district and the land-based nations that connect you to the elders and knowledge keepers who you hopefully are able to bring into your school. And also equally as important is those outside agencies that really support our families beyond the scope of the school, right? So we're going to kind of unpack these things tonight. I want to read this beautiful piece of writing before we get started because I'm working at SFU as at UBC as a faculty advisor, and I was observing one of my teacher candidates who is just brilliant. She's Cree and she wanted to share this story with students, and it just had a profound effect on me. So just sort of sit back and I'm going to read it to you. And I want you to think about while I'm reading it, why I'm using this piece tonight. So it's called Upside Down and Backwards. I write in the dimness of morning. Outside the world is shapeshifter. Light eases things back into definition, their boundaries called from shadow, hardening, forming, beginning to hold again, and the land shrugs itself into wakefulness. Purple moving upwards into pearl gray. It's good to be up and working at this time. I can feel the power of life and light around me, and as the letters form upon the screen, race each other to the sudden halt of punctuation, I understand where this need to write comes from. It comes from a palpable mystery, the first light breaking over everything, altering things, arranging them, setting them down into patterns again, and tucking shadow back into folds behind the trees. It comes from the need of communication, of joining with that great mystery, that force, that energy. I always wanted to write. There isn't a time I can recall when I didn't carry the desire to frame things, order things upon a page, sort them out, make sense of them. But in the beginning, learning to write was a test, a challenge, an ordeal. I was the only Indian boy in a mill town in northern Ontario in the early 1960s. It was a different world then, harder maybe, colder, and the idea of Indians was set like concrete, particularly in the patriarchal working class confines of a sawmill town 200 miles from nowhere. The school was set between the railway tracks and the pipeline in a hollow between hills above the mill. We sat in this thick sulfur smell coming in through the windows and the spume of the stacks on the horizon above the trees. In the classroom, I was ignored, set down near the back, and never called upon for anything. They said I was slow, a difficult learner, far too quiet for a kid, and lethargic. They said I hadn't had much hope for a future, and after they held me back a year, they just let me be. But I wanted to learn. I was hungry for it, and I went to school every day, eager and excited about the things we were given to learn. But I couldn't see. No one had spent enough time with me to learn that. The reason I was slow to pick things up was because I could not see the board. Even at the front of the room, where they put me so that they could keep a better eye on me, I could never discern the writing on the blackboard. Everything I learned by memory, by listening hard to what the teacher said, and by memorizing it. When I was adopted in 1965, I was sent to my first big school in Southern Ontario called Bradford, just north of Toronto. There were hundreds of kids in the school, and it seemed like I walked in waves of them on my way to school that first day. Walking through those big glass doors was terrifying for me. I was in grade 3, and my teacher wanted to introduce me, and she asked me to write my name on the board for the other children to read. I went to the board, leaned close to it, squinted, and began to write. I heard snickers at the first letter and open laughter when I had finished. I had written my name upside down and backwards. To the rest of my classmates, it was odd, strange, and hilarious, but it was how I learned, and I felt the weight of their laughter like stones. Walking back to my seat that day, I felt ashamed, stupid, and terribly alone. But I had a teacher that cared. She walked me down to the nurse's station herself and waited while I got my eyes tested. Astigmatism, the nurse told her. Terrible astigmatism. Then she listened closely to me when I explained why my writing was wrongly shaped. I taught myself to write by squinting back over my shoulder. When we were taught to write in script, I wasn't given any teacher attention, wasn't offered any help in forming the letters. So I watched the boy behind me and I mimicked what I saw on my own page. Unfortunately, what I saw was upside down and backwards, and that is how I taught myself to write. I could spell everything correctly, but it was all skewed. Well, I got glasses very shortly, and after that, my world changed. Once I could see what was written on the board, my ability to learn accelerated, and I graduated grade 3 with straight A's, especially in penmanship. See, for the teacher, I wasn't an Indian. I was a student in need. So she took the time to show me how to write properly. Every day, before and after school, she and I sat at a desk and we worked through the primary writing books. I shaped letters time after time until I gradually unlearned the awkward process I had taught myself. Like life, unlearning something was a lot harder than learning it. I struggled with breaking down my method, and at times it seemed I would never get it right. But I persisted with the help and encouragement of that teacher, and I learned how to write in the right direction. But I still shape my G's and D's wrong today. I still write them back to front after all this time. I write on the keyboard these days, but there isn't a time when I set pen to paper that I don't remember things. I don't remember learning how to write and what it took to get me there. And if you want a copy of this piece, if you click on this link, you can download it. And I'm just wondering, I share this story because it resonated with me so much, and but I would like to hear what you think. So if you want to raise your hand and speak, I would love to hear your thoughts. Diana, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, hello. It resonates with me a little bit, as my brother, when he was in grade 2, also couldn't see the chalkboard when he was a child and got deemed as like that kid that just can't learn, can't pay attention. And he failed grade 2, so then we ended up being in the same grade. And that view of him kind of stuck. So it was like he had to live up to that. Eventually, we figured out that he just needed some glasses. But I just feel if he had a teacher that was like that when he was a child, his whole world could have been totally different. And it's just really sad. I feel like too, like teachers have so much on their plate too. It's really probably difficult for them to help out so many teachers as well, or so many students, because I feel like there's a lot of need right now. But yeah, that's my thought. Thank you for sharing that.
Isn't it beautiful? Oh, if you were to see my penmanship, you would understand why it resonated with me. And I would be sent home with penmanship activities, and it never improved, and it blocked my head. It made if my work doesn't look nice, it can't be good. So yeah, that one caring teacher made a difference. Thank you. Jennifer, do you want to add to that?
Thank you for this opportunity to share. In August 2018, I was diagnosed with an eye disease,
Okay.
and after seeing a couple of ophthalmologists, I had pretty major surgery in August, and um, sometimes I still get double vision and I can't see as well during staff meetings or at school when I'm teaching, and it's been pretty scary. So I've just been grateful for students that have been patient when I enlarge the board, um, and being kind enough to enlarge photocopies. And I just identify with having like a disability with my vision. And I just am inspired to hopefully be that type of teacher that helps.
Well, and I think what you're doing too by increasing the font so that you can read it is you're modeling to students that we all have diverse needs, and so you're just modeling an accommodation, and I think that's lovely. I think that students can take a lot from that we don't all learn exactly the same way, that some of us need extra supports to. It's not that we're not able to learn, it's just that maybe we need some extra supports like enlarged font to be able to read. Thanks for sharing that. Nikki, did you want to add to that?
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks to everybody for sharing all the stuff that they've gone through as well. It's enlightening, and it helps me learn and remember things for my own son, and from when we're in after school programs and stuff. My experience, I really resonated with when he was talking about the writing the name backwards and everything on the board, because I'm dyslexic. So I was born in 78. So when I was in grade 3, ironic, grade 3 seems to be, I notice a pattern. I was grade 3, they were going to fail me because, again, I was labeled dumb, stupid, lazy. I had a fighter of a mom, though, that was like, no, she'd had 2 kids 20 years before me. And so she was like, no, something's off. But to this day, it sits with me. I'm the first one to, when I teach or facilitate or have
See you
any
tomorrow.
children, I'm the first one to say, I'm dyslexic. My letters get in the wrong spots. Comprehension is challenging. And so when teachers are asking stuff, to put questions up. So having that class laugh at him, I can relate with that, because that used to happen a lot in the 80s for myself. But anyways, thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think there's many students with issues that, and I think we need to talk about that more. And I think, I remember about 5-6 years ago, the universal design of learning, we need to understand that many of us need accommodations to learn and thrive in schools, and that there's nothing wrong with having accommodation. And I think for me, sometimes technology was my lifesaver. I used to teach some high school students how to use a program called Kurzweil, and it would read text aloud to students. It would have built-in word prediction. It was amazing software. So it gave kids access to the curriculum, and they didn't need to have a scribe sitting next to them or an adult reading for them. It gave students back that independence. So yeah, thank you. Is there anybody else who wants to share a little bit about that? I think that one thing I want to touch on is and I'm hoping, I know things are changing, is that because he was Indigenous, I've talked previously about the culture of low expectations. He was, you're a dumb Indian. And I know I have talked to parents who have experienced that same feeling when they went to school. So I think, my hope of these sessions is that, by forming those relationships with our students and families, we will eradicate some of those, those misconceptions. So great, thank you. So I just want to, so the first thing I want to talk about then is creating a safe and inviting space for Indigenous students and their families. And, when Twyla and I first started talking about this, we're not talking about the aesthetics, it's not about just having posters up and that, but it's acknowledging the local land-based nations and Métis groups in your area so that they have a presence in the school. By having those things up, it will help our students feel that this is a safe place for them to be. For me, the biggest issue, the most important issue is your front office staff, right? I've been in the front office when some of our students have come in late, and I've heard some really awesome front office staff say, "Oh, Nadine, you're here, great. Here's your slip. You head right down to your classroom. We're so glad you're here." And that's the kind of front office staff that we really need to have, just celebrating that the student is there, and that, you know, let's not say, "Oh, you're late again." So that, I think, is super important. For me, I think it's also really important that the front office staff know who the support workers and Indigenous staff are in the schools, and that they know what their schedules are. So if one of our Indigenous families or parents come in and want to talk to that person, they're able to locate them quickly, right? I think that's super important. But that front office staff, they are often the first point of contact for our Indigenous families. And if something negative happens, it's super hard to win our families back. And I'm thinking a case in point when we were registering a young family for kindergarten at an elementary school. And, you know, this is a system change that needs to happen. And if any of you have registered your children for kindergarten, you will understand it's not an easy feat. You have to have a copy of their long birth certificate. You have to have proof of residency. You have to have vaccination records. There's so much you have to have. There's about 8 things, I think, that are required. So we came in with this parent, and she had 7 of the 8. She didn't have a copy of proof of residence because she had just moved to the area. Now, instead of saying, "Oh, thank you for bringing in these forms, we'll take those, and you know, as soon as you can bring in proof of residency, that will be great. Then we can get you registered." What this clerk said is, "Nope, we can't register you until you have proof of residency. We won't take any of your forms." And we could just see kind of the horror on that parent's face. And, you know, it took a lot of work to win her back. Diana, I see your hand up. Do you want to add to this?
Yes, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Oh.
I was part of one professional development at my school. When I worked in the school, we had we did this I don't know what to call it. My brain's not working so well. But we had to pretend that we were that, you know, vulnerable student that showed up late for school, and what it would have been like to like walk into the school, check into the office, walk down the hallways, everyone's looking at you, walk into a classroom late. And like, I really put myself in some students' shoes, and it was like really difficult, like just thinking about all those things. Like, we really need to you know, put ourselves in their shoes. Sometimes life isn't so easy, and sometimes things are out of our control, right? And it would be very difficult for a student.
And you know, what a brilliant Pro D that was. What a great
Mhm.
activity that was, because I think, you know, I know that front office staff are, you know, they want our kids to be there. They want all kids to be there. But, you know, by making it punitive, by making them feel bad for being late, you're not going to win them over. You know,
Mhm.
what I would prefer is that they say, "Oh, we're glad you're here. Hey, I noticed, you know, you've been late. Is there something that we can do to help? Can we phone you in the morning, or can we get you an alarm clock?" There are better ways to deal with it.
Mhm.
So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so front office staff are key. I really think so. I think that so that would, I think, for it to be a safe and inviting space, it's getting those front office staff to make that space super inviting for our families, no matter what they're coming in for. Another thing that we talked about last week was a bulletin board, and someone shared this brilliant idea that we should have a QR code on that bulletin board that links to the Indigenous staff in the school. So if I was the Aboriginal support worker, I would pop up in a video and I would say, hi, my name is Nadine McSpadden. I'm the Aboriginal support worker in the school. I'm here on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Here's my email if you need to get a hold of me. So glad that you've connected with me. I'm here to support you and your child. I think that's a brilliant idea. One, because it gives parents an opportunity to see the face of the person who's supporting their children, and I think that's wonderful. So this bulletin board, I think, is really important, and it needs to be in a prominent place. Too often I've seen them in the back of the school. We want not only our Indigenous families to see the bulletin boards, but we also want non-Indigenous families to recognize that the school acknowledges the importance of connecting with Indigenous families and agencies. So I really think that's super important to have it in the front of the school. It could contain not only information about school programs, upcoming assemblies, any kind of Indigenous events that are happening in the school. That would be great to have on there, but I think it's also important to have information about community supports. So I'm thinking for Surrey School District, when I worked there, we had flyers of FRAFCA, the Friendship Center, and Métis Nation BC. We also had Métis Family Services. So we would have brochures about those so that our families could connect with community supports outside of school. And I think that's super useful. On this, the picture here featured on the screen, remember the school last year or last week I showed where they had the sign elders parking? They had this beautiful mural on the wall just as you walk in that has the territorial land acknowledgement. That says a lot, I think, and it goes beyond being performative because it was featured in such a prominent place. Next to it, they had someone had carved a beautiful spindle whorl. And when I asked the staff, but there's no descriptor of who's the artist and the just information about the project to have that done, but it was coming. So, I think having the territorial acknowledgement up at the front of the school will make parents feel, wow, this is a school that's trying to get me, that is making extra efforts to acknowledge who were the original inhabitants of this area. So I think it's super important to do that. Another way to create a safe space is just having Indigenous artwork from local Indigenous artists, if possible. I've seen lots. I've walked into many schools, and I'll see Indigenous art on the wall, and it won't have the name of the artist who did it. And it may have been done 10 years ago. So the principal who was responsible for getting the funding for this particular art piece has long gone. So there's no history of that art. And I think it does such a disservice. So I think, making sure that if there's Indigenous art from local Indigenous artists, it needs to have a write-up. So this art was done by the name of the artist, what nation he or she was from, and, how was his project? How did the funding come into place for this? It needs to be a legacy piece, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. An idea I had because of that brilliant QR code idea last week is having a student videotape a student describing the project and how it came to be, and then attaching a QR code to that. I also think it's another key to communicating and creating a safe space for our students and families is having an Indigenous department website. And on that website, we'll talk about the enhancement agreement if the school is done an enhancement agreement, or any of the district goals relating to Indigenous education. I think that's important, and also the types of support that are available in schools. And I think, often our families don't know who are the kids in the district who are supporting their students. So if there could be a descriptor on there, so, elementary schools have an Aboriginal support worker, maybe there's other roles, maybe cultural facilitators. If that information is on the website, it would give parents some idea of the types of support in the district. It would also help district staff, right? So they know the roles and responsibilities of the support teachers and the Indigenous support staff in schools. And the last thing I think that would make a super safe and inviting space for our students and families is having some kind of protocol in place for bringing in knowledge keepers and elders. And I've created a hyperlink here, and I'm going to see if it works. And can you give me a thumbs up, someone, if you can see my screen here? Diane, I'm going to call on you. Can you see the screen? Can you see the guidelines for working with Indigenous elders?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this is another document that Len-Pierre Consulting has created. And I think it's a beautiful document on how to support them when they come into schools, and what is the role of an Indigenous elder and a knowledge keeper. So please feel free to download this and use this in wherever you are. I think it's a beautiful document. Okay, now I've got to figure out how to get back to PowerPoint. Okay,
Click on
One.
the tab up above.
the tab right there,
No,
there,
coffee and conversation.
Coffee. I don't see it.
Go up to the top. You see
Okay.
there's Zoom, and then right beside the next tab is coffee and conversation.
Okay, hang on a second. I gotta move this down. I'll go down to Zoom here. Oh no, hang on, guys. I'll get back there, I promise. Anyways, it's a beautiful document. And I'm just gonna stop sharing and then I'll come back. There we go.
Okay.
Okay, share screen. Yeah, I love that document, and I know that I think it's super important for people to have a chance to see it. Hang on, there we are. I'm back on screen. Yay! Thanks for your patience. Because I too often I've seen school districts will invite in a knowledge keeper, and or an elder, and there's no one at the door to greet them as they come in. There's nowhere when they've come into a classroom. Have they thought about having a comfortable chair if it's a senior elder? Have they got a glass of water ready for them because their throat will get dry when they're talking in front of students? Have they scheduled enough time for this elder or knowledge keeper to come in? And I think having those protocols in place is important, because how we treat those elders or knowledge keepers when they come into our schools and into our classrooms says a lot about who we are. And it also models how we expect our students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, to treat them. So yeah, I hope you take a look at that document. Okay, next one. I'm just going to pause there. Does anybody else want to add some suggestions or ideas on how they think? Yeah. Any questions about creating a safe space for students and families? Do you have any suggestions that you'd like to share? Okay, well, we'll carry on. And then one of the things that a couple of schools did in Surrey is we had and I love doing these, an event called Banneken Books. And this is an after-school program, and it's only open to Indigenous families. And the session started off with food. So we have bannock, and we have drinks, and we have vegetable snacks and cheese and stuff for the families. And it's a chance for just our Indigenous families to come into the library and have some food together, because that's the way we start all good work. And then, after about 20 minutes, the principal will introduce himself, and then introduce the staff who are there. And then we will read an Indigenous story that's selected for the event. And then we have 4 or 5 learning stations relating to literacy and math, and all that also relate to the book. And I love these sessions because originally it was intended to get Indigenous stories into the hands of our students and into the homes. But another amazing thing happened when we started running them. Our Indigenous families were able to connect with each other. So in Surrey School District, there were a number of families who were not from this area. So when they came to these Banneken Book sessions after school, they could connect with other Indigenous families, and that made it easier for them to go to cultural events offered by FRAFCA or other Indigenous organizations in the area. So it was a great way for bringing Indigenous families into the school. Sonia who was Aboriginal child and youth care worker at one of her schools. She had a storytelling night. So she received a grant and brought in 4 different storytellers from the community and invited parents and families in for story time. Not book story time, but oral storytelling. And they were fed snacks. And again, this was an opportunity for our families to come to get together and know who the other Indigenous families were in the school. It was really cute too, because I often hear kids say, well, I didn't know you were Indigenous. I didn't know you were Indigenous either. So it was a great way for our kids to connect. So just I want to talk a little bit about suggestions for connecting with parents and or guardians. Really encourage the classroom teacher to initiate that positive contact in September. Too often when I worked in schools, if parents wanted to reach one of our families, they would say, hey, Nadine, could you give such and such a call? You know, the child's been away for 4 days. So I would say to that teacher, you know, you're the classroom teacher, it would really be best if you gave them a call. So passing that ownership back to the classroom teacher when possible. And before they have to make a call about attendance or something, encouraging them to make those really positive contacts in September. So giving them a call, giving our families a call and saying, hey, you know, I'm Nadine McSpadden, I'm your child's grade 1 teacher. So happy that she's in our class. You know, here's my email. If anything comes up, please feel free to email or call the school. Just so that our parents have connected with the Indigenous the parent has connected with the classroom teacher in a very positive way in September. I would, you know, and I think teachers do try to do this. Someone mentioned earlier, it's getting so hard for classroom teachers because the burden of being a classroom teacher is getting greater and greater. But building these positive relationships with the families is will serve you so well. Maintaining positive communications with the families as much as possible. So that might be, you know, in their daily planner that they do in elementary schools, just writing a note, hey, you know, and writing something positive that the Indigenous child had done in the class that week, that goes a long ways. If possible, you know, be outside and meet parents when they're dropping off their kids or picking them up, just so that these our families have a connection to your face and know who you are. I think that's really good. And, you know, I've had teachers say, well, why do I have to go to the extra effort for Indigenous families? And if you're asking that question, you need to go to some professional development. That's all I'm going to say there. But personally inviting Indigenous parents and guardians on field trips and to special assemblies, like making that phone call, reminding them about the event, I think is super important. And also to be mindful, you know, when we talk about parents and guardians, we have to be mindful of the role of extended families in our communities. So, you know, when it's family night, that's going to be mom and dad and aunties and uncles and grandmas and grandpas. So be prepared and be very welcoming of those extended families. One of the amazing things about making positive relationships with your families is, you know, if they feel safe with you, they might be willing to come in and do some kind of event for your classroom. And I've seen that happen many times. I've seen parents come in and make bannock with kids. I've seen parents who've come in and shown some beadwork that they've done. So by building those positive relationships with parents, it can be good for you and good for your student. So we're going to try something here. We're going to try a poll. So Candace, do you want to launch the poll and we'll see what happens. So I've got 4 questions here that I want you to answer. And what should happen is the results should show up on our screen right away. So first question, does your school have a dedicated bulletin board for Indigenous students and their families in a prominent location? And does your front office staff have a copy of schedules for the Indigenous staff in your school? And has your front office staff received professional development related to supporting Indigenous families? And that I think is super, super key. And does your Indigenous department have a website? So have you launched the poll, Candace? Okay, are
Yes.
you all seeing the poll and the questions?
Yeah, answers are coming in. I can see them live on my screen.
Okay, can you share your screen so we can see the results, Candace?
Yeah, just give me 1 second here. If I could figure it out, why are you being so mean? Can you see the poll in the center of the screen?
Nope.
Okay. Stop sharing. Let's see what happens. Now I've lost my poll. Let me see if I can find the poll. There we go. Yeah. For some reason, I guess I cannot share the poll on my screen, but I can give everyone another 15 seconds for answers, and then I can share your results.
If you can see them on your screen, maybe
Yeah.
you can do a screenshot and then post it in the chat, and then we can all see the results.
Mhm. All right. Sounds like that's all everyone's answers. I'm going to end the poll. I'm going to share the results. Can you guys see the results?
No.
I've got some nods.
Yes, yes, I can.
Okay. Is it in the
Okay.
chat box that the results show up?
It's
Okay.
a pop-up window on your computer screen.
Okay.
And you can
Nadine.
scroll down to see all the responses.
So Nadine, can you find that on as a pop-up on your screen?
I don't see it, but it might
Okay,
be
I'm
'cause-
wondering if it's because you're a co-host.
yeah.
So um
Yeah. So does anybody want to comment on the results? Because you can see it and I can't.
Hmm.
Or any, yeah, any comments on the results?
Okay. So Nadine, I'll just give you the overview. So for question 1, does your school have a dedicated bulletin board for Indigenous students? 22% said yes, 65% said no, and 13% said yes, but not in a prominent location. Does your office staff have a copy of schedules for Indigenous staff in the school? And 41% said yes, and 59% said no. Has the office staff received a professional development related to supporting Indigenous families? 43% said yes, and 57% said no. And lastly, does your Indigenous department have a website? 63% said yes, and 38% said no.
Perfect. Perfect. I'm glad to see there are some bulletin boards there. I'm sorry, Candace, can you say the professional development one, the front office staff and professional development?
It is 43% yes.
Good, good. Because I think, in some of the districts I've worked at, that has been a barrier. There's been a reluctance to make it mandatory that front office staff have professional development around it supporting Indigenous families. And I think it does the district and our schools such a disservice. So, Len Pierre has done tons of work around cultural safety. We're going to talk about that next week. So, making sure that front office staff has that training around cultural safety and making sure that school is a safe place for our kids, I think is super, super important. Okay, let's go back to. Okay, so we've done
So
the
we're in our
poll.
last 10 minutes, Nadine.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. This is more about your Indigenous staff, and Candace, you can probably speak to this somewhat. Making sure that your Indigenous staff in your school have a safe, dedicated place to work, particularly when we need to have confidential conversations with a student or family members. I can't tell you how many times our offices were often closets, and I know real estate is always an issue in schools, but if you don't have a dedicated place for our Indigenous staff in your schools, it sends a pretty powerful message to our families. you know, if they have to have a conversation in the photocopy room with the door shut because that's the only place in the school, it doesn't send a strong message that taking care of Indigenous students in this school is a priority for your district. Yeah. And then are your Indigenous support staff, are they being introduced at staff meetings? So particularly at the beginning of the year, so they can explain what their roles and responsibilities are and their schedule. I think that is super important. Are your Aboriginal youth care workers or support team, are they invited to IEP meetings and school-based team meetings and ICMs? And if so, have they actually received professional development relating to these meetings? It's, you know, I feel for our support staff sometimes because they have to sit at the table at some of these meetings with district psychologists, with teachers, with principals, and it's not a completely level playing field. So providing them with that professional development around the process of designating students that talks about, you know, what an IEP should include, will make sure that when they attend these meetings, they have the tools they need to be successful. And just, you know, are the admin in the school and school-based team members, are they connecting with the Indigenous staff in the school regularly? Because our staff tends to know our kids really well. So it's important that mode of communication stay open. And are your Indigenous staff invited to professional development opportunities that happen in the school? And are they also invited to social events that happen in the school? We need, you know, the schools to be a safe place for our Indigenous staff. And I can tell you, as working as an itinerant teacher in Indigenous ed, you know, I had 4 schools when I first started in Surrey, and, you know, it took me about a year to feel comfortable in staff rooms. So, you know, is there a way that we can do better to make these staff rooms and meetings more inviting for our Indigenous staff? Your department, a lot of our schools, or a lot of school districts now have a resource library, and I think this is brilliant. It's not that they are responsible to provide all the Indigenous resources for all the schools, but the most libraries that I've seen now, they will buy 1 or 2 copies of a new resource so that a school can look at it and try it out. And if it's a good fit, then the school can purchase it as part of their purchasing plan. So having access to authentic Indigenous resources is super important. So if your district doesn't have a resource library, you know, is there some way that one can be developed? I think is super valuable. Does your staff also have a vetted list of Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders? And I know this is a big ask of Indigenous departments. What I strongly encourage teachers to do is to go to public events like powwows. Earl Marriott Powwow is coming up very soon. Go to those events and try and connect with elders and knowledge keepers there if you can. But, you know, reaching out to your Indigenous department to find out if there are vetted knowledge keepers or elders who can come on in. And check with your Indigenous department too to see if they are actually hosting professional development. You know, I think that's important to attend to those events if your Indigenous department is offering them. And we'll skip this poll. Yeah, so these are just some of the community events that are coming up. So Earl Marriott on March 8th, 9th, and 10th, they have their annual powwow. They have tons of vendors there. It's open to the public, and it's a great way to learn a little bit more about Indigenous culture and connect with those community members. It's a great opportunity to go. Skookum is an organization that's in Surrey now, and they're offering events in the evening for First Nation families in the area. That's an example of an outside agency that you can connect with. I can't say this, maybe Candace, can you say it? This is Stalwea.
You're not sharing your screen, so I can't see what
Oh,
you have
am I
up.
not sharing my screen?
No.
Oh, man. Okay. Now am I sharing my screen?
Yes. Yeah.
You guys, this is a gong show tonight. My apologies. Yeah, so here's the flyer for Earl Marriott Powwow, which is great. Skookum Labs, they offer evening events for community members, and this organization here on the right.
Stalu Arts and Culture.
Yeah. they offer amazing events too. So, you know, if you're on Facebook, if you want to follow me, I post any community events that are happening in the Lower Mainland. Please feel free to follow me. But go
Hobier is
to the
happening
event.
soon. The
Okay,
Niska New Year down at the Peony.
Yeah, and Rain Pierre, who's a local Catesy artist, he is having his first art show coming up in March. So, you know, by attending these things, not only do you build your knowledge and capacity as classroom teachers, but you get to know community members too. I know around Canada Day and National Indigenous Peoples Day, there are all kinds of events that happen. So check them out. And again, if you follow me on Facebook or Twitter, you'll see these events listed here. And then I also connect with land-based nations, and you can too, through workshops. So this is an elder I know from Musqueam. She does Cedar Roses. She had a Cedar Heart workshop. Rita is her name, Rita Comst, and they're open to the public, right? So by engaging in a workshop like that, you get to know an actual Musqueam artist. I know Fort Langley has numerous events. They've just opened their cafe again at the fort, and Tradish is opening the kitchen there, and they have incredible food. So there's a chance to connect. And Candace, you mentioned earlier about Hobier.
Yeah.
So these are all ways that you can connect with land-based nations and community members. I meant to put up, there's something coming up from I think it's the Dancy Métis dancing group. They're going to have an event happening in about a month and a half time. They said to stay posted, they'll have more information. So again, follow me on Facebook and you'll see these events. Yeah, and I just really, you know, these outside agencies are just amazing, the work that they do. Not only do they provide support for our families around culture, but also around other issues like housing and food and clothing. They're able to provide supports for those too. Some other agencies that we have always connected with when I worked in Surrey and Maple Ridge Pit Meadows is the Friendship Center, of course, Métis Family Services, Métis Nation BC, Indigenous Child and Youth Mental Health. So try and find out who are the local friendship centers and Métis groups in your area and connect with them. When you have that information, when you have a family member or a parent come in and wanting to know more about cultural events in the area, you can share these resources with them. This is also great stuff to have up on your bulletin board. So why does building relationships matter?
2 more minutes.
Pardon me?
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Okay. Well, I'm gonna stop sharing here. Well, you can quickly read this, but I want to know your thoughts. So why do you think it's important to build these relationships? I'll stop sharing here. I want to hear from you guys. So what happens when we build positive relationships with students, families, outside agencies, and our Indigenous support staff in schools? Diane, is your hand up? Oh.
You build trust with the families. You get them to come back, you get them to ask more questions, you get them to be more involved. Relationship building is key to any kind of relationship you want to build.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
Without a relationship, you can't have any connection, and without connection, you're never going to build trust. So it's the foundation to any to any sort of movement.
Yeah.
One
of our dear friends, Lise Gillis, she works for Island Health. I'm quoting her probably every day now, but it's like we move at the speed of trust as Indigenous people. So that's a huge one.
And you know, I talk from my uncle's perspective and my auntie's perspective, who are residential school survivors, and that trust was eroded as a result of Indian residential schools. So yes, it takes longer for our families to retrust again, but it's worth the effort. It is so worth the effort. Yeah. Any other thoughts that come to mind, or anything else you would like to share? Elaine, do you have your hand up?
Listening
saying-
is important, she said.
Yes. Talk less, listen more.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming on Valentine's. I hope you're going to go and do something good for yourself tonight. I hope you have found this informative. Next session, we're going to be looking at cultural safety, and we'll be looking more specifically at school-based team meetings and designation meetings and approaching those from a very culturally safe perspective. So in my language, I would say Kuksjachum for giving of your time today. I'm so glad to have seen you here today. And please check out Lenpierre Consulting's webpage. And particularly if you scroll down to the bottom to the resources, there are some really good resources there. So again, Kuksjachum for being here, and you have a good night. Take care of yourselves.